Printing in SketchUp can be a little confusing, so here are some tips to help alleviate perhaps some of the pain. So first of all, let's say I want to print this view of the face frame. If I go to File, there are several options here. So the first thing you want to do is go to Print Setup and make sure the correct printer is selected. And here is where you would pick portrait or landscape. So that's going to vary depending on the view that you're looking at. In this particular case, because this is pretty wide, I'm going to stick with landscape. So next, I'll go to File again and Print Preview. So here's the Preview button. Note that you do not have the option here to select portrait or landscape. You have to do that on the Print Setup screen. So right now, Fit to Page is selected. If I uncheck that, I can actually type in the size of the page that I want. So I'm going to leave that checked because I want it to fit onto the page that I've chosen. My print quality is set to standard. I'm not going to check this use high accuracy HLR because this is just a perspective view and it's not to scale, so that really doesn't matter. So I'm going to click OK. So there's my preview of the view that I was just looking at. And note that it's fairly small on the page. That's because, if I close this, that's because there was a lot of white space around here. So in order to make this work better, I need to resize the screen. So I'll bring this in to get rid of some of the white space around there. So that looks a little better. I'll orbit a bit. And if I need to zoom, if I roll the mouse wheel forward and back, that's a little coarse to get what I want. So if I want to fine-tune the zoom level, I'm going to tap Z for zoom, and then I can hold down the left mouse button and move the mouse back and forth to get exactly what I want. So that looks good. There's not a lot of extra space around the image. I'm going to go back to File, Print Preview, and now I'm going to make sure that Fit to Page is selected. Note now that the page size, even though it's grayed out, is 8 by 8. Before, I think it was 8 something by, or 10 or so by 8. So now when I click OK, my preview looks better. It's much bigger on the screen because I've gotten rid of a lot of that white space. So I'll close that. This time, I'm going to go to Print Setup, and I'll switch to Portrait, because depending on the size of the image, it could look better. In this case, because it showed about 8 by 8 before, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference, but we'll just do this to show it. So now that's in portrait mode. And of course, at this point, if I want to print, I would go to the print dialog box, and notice now this says print up here, not print preview. If I click OK, it'll send it to my printer. Now let's say you want to print this to scale. So if I go back to print preview, now if I'm printing to scale, I can't click Fit to Page, so I'm going to uncheck that. But notice I still can't enter information in the scale box here. That's because I'm in perspective view. In perspective view, scale doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to switch the camera to parallel projection. I'm going to switch to a front view. And I'll resize this a little bit, make that a little better. I'll zoom a little to get rid of the white space, so that looks good. So now I'm in parallel projection. I've got a good view here. And now I should be able to, if I uncheck fit to page, now I can use these scale options. So if I want to print it, say full scale, I'd say, let's make this 1:1. Now, note, I'm going to hit tab just to get that to the next screen here. Note that if I did this, I would have 24 pages. Because of the size of this, it's about 41 wide and 34 tall. That's a lot of things to print, and if I'm only using letter size paper, it's going to take a lot of sheets, so that's not very helpful. Let's change the scale to 1:5. I'll hit tab again to do that. And now at 1/5 scale, the width of my page is 8 inches, the height is 6 inches, so 6 inches. That's much smaller. And you can see here I'm going to be using 2 pages. Now, since the width is wider than the height, I'm going to cancel out of here and switch back to print setup and switch that to landscape because I want the width wider than the height. Now I'll come back to print preview. I'll uncheck that, change this back to 1:5. And now note that it's going to fit on one page. It's just printing from 1:1. I'll check high accuracy if that matters at this point. Probably not a big deal. Now when I go to print preview, there is my model printed at 1/5 scale. Now let's say I wanted to print one of these parts out at full scale. So I've got one of them shown over here. This is the lower mullion. So I'm going to orbit so it's as big as I can get it. Now, once again, I want to get rid of a lot of this white space around here. Otherwise, I'm going to use a lot of paper. So I'll bring that in and pan to get that into position. Looks like I can get rid of a little more material there. So there's not a lot of white space there. I want to make sure I'm in portrait mode, since that's going to be taller. And now if I go to print preview, and I want to print this full scale, so currently it's printing at 1:5. I'm going to make this 1:1. Hit tab. And notice now it's printing 2 pages because it's going to take 2 pages to print that out. And if I look here, the width of the page is about 4.5 inches. The height's 21, which will fit on 2 8.5 by 11 pages. So now when I click OK, I'll open this back up so I can see better. So that would be my first page. And then the next page is going to, of course, be the bottom half of that. So if I printed that out, I would get 2 pages. I could cut it along here and then paste those or tape those pages together to get a full scale image of my part. Now for something like this, that's probably not a big deal, but if I had some curves in here, let's say that was a curved part for a leg or something, that might be really helpful to print out full scale and be able to use that as a pattern for making my parts. So, like I said, SketchUp and printing can be a little tricky. Sometimes you have to play around with the settings to get what you want, but just remember, select your printer here, and here's where you select portrait and landscape. And in the print preview section here, you can, if you want to, print to scale Otherwise, just say fit to page and it will print as big as it can. But remember, you really need to resize the SketchUp window to get rid of any extra space.